Psychoanalytic criticism is the interpretation of a literary work based on the techniques and principles that are developed in the field of psychology. Let us now take a look at the origin, development, and the various ways in which these theories are applied to literary analysis. What is psychology? Psychology is the study of the human mind. It tries to understand how the human mind or the human psyche actually works. This scientific discipline will enable us to get a clearer understanding as to how the human mind processes information, facts, logic, memory, and more importantly, the perception of the entire world through our senses. The term psyche is actually taken from the Greek goddess Psyche, who is regarded as the spirit of the soul. Moving on, this particular symbol that you see here, which is the symbol of psychology, is actually the first Greek alphabet that is used to write psyche. The history of philosophy will enable us to understand how the philosophers of the 4th century BC like Plato and Aristotle, along with the philosophers of the 17th century like René Descartes and John Locke, were also interested in the underpinnings or the various processes that took place inside the human psyche. Some of the notable figures who were quite influential in the development of psychology would be Wilhelm Wundt, Edward Titchener, William James, Ernest Jones, Carl Jung, and more importantly, Sigmund Freud. What is psychoanalysis? Psychoanalysis is a field of psychology that was developed in the works of Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud was an Austrian neurologist who was clinically trained in the field of neurology. He was an academician, and at the same time he also had his own clinical practice to treat patients. He came up with new theories and methods to cure patients with hysteria or mental illness. Freud believed that human beings developed into adults based on their experiences in childhood. He came up with a concept called infantile sexuality based on the idea that human beings developed sexual urges even when they were just babies in the cradle. Freud believed that the child at this point was an accumulation of various drives and various instincts. Drives, according to Freud, are psychological needs that are inherently present in a human being. So the child, even though it cannot distinguish between any gender, or even though it doesn't even have the capacity to identify its own self as a subjective being, is acting on a certain principle called the pleasure principle. These drives will enable the child to gratify instant pleasure. So the child at this point is actually a being that often searches for pleasure in any situation. This leads the child to develop what would be certain erotogenic zones in its own body. First, the child will enter into what would be the oral stage. In the oral stage, it will derive pleasure from sucking its own thumb, and later on it will develop into what would be the anal stage. And after that, it will come to what would be the phallic stage. When it enters into the oral stage, it is automatically given that it has entered into the libidinal dimension. After crossing the phallic stage, it has completely developed this libidinal drive. Even though the child is unable to direct this particular drive towards any external object, it will direct it towards the mother. So this is what Freud exactly calls as the Oedipus complex. Freud thought that the child will develop a sense of rivalry or hatred towards the father because it wants the undivided attention from the mother. The Oedipus complex is a very important theory to the works of Sigmund Freud, because the entire premises of psychoanalysis is actually built on this particular theory. Freudian analysis or psychoanalysis gives more importance to this particular theory, the Oedipus complex, because every other theory is actually structured or based upon this idea. When the child is introduced to the father, it is actually introduced to the concept of conscience. It is introduced to the prospect of morality, society, and how exactly family works. So, with the introduction of the father, the child actually represses these desires that were once directed towards the mother. Repression is another important Freudian concept that we must be aware of. This repression of desires will automatically give birth to what would be the unconscious. The unconscious is perhaps a very important theory that was developed in the works of Sigmund Freud. The child that emerges from the Oedipus complex is actually a split individual. It is split between the conscious and the unconscious. The conscious is that part of the psyche in which we have a sense of awareness towards the things that happen in it. But the unconscious is actually a deeper structure where its happenings or its processes nor its contents are not exactly visible or aware to us. We do not know what exactly happens in the unconscious. Now we get to a point where the child enters into what would be the reality principle. You may even say that this is the development of the child from following the pleasure principle to accepting the reality principle. So for the rest of his life he will adopt this reality principle and forever repress desires, motives and thoughts that are not exactly acceptable to society at large. The conscious is actually the subjective being. It has to fend off against the thoughts that emerge from the unconscious. You may even say that the unconscious is a reservoir of thoughts, motives and desires that are not exactly healthy when they surface to the conscious. And hence the conscious will always try its best to keep the elements in the unconscious suppressed. Freud believed that the unconscious can be accessed rarely during parapraxis or Freudian slips. He believed that these are indirect ways in which we get a view of what exactly happens in the unconscious, because sometimes human beings are guided or they are predominantly influenced by these inner desires or inner motives that are suppressed in the unconscious. The unconscious is a very important concept developed in the field of psychoanalysis by Freud, but even though it is not completely defined as to its processes as well as its contents, we can be rest assured that it has a very influential role to play in shaping up a person's psyche or or generating a sense of motive or desire for how people actually behave or how they actually do certain things. Freud believed that human beings develop psychological problems or mental disorders when this conflict between the conscious and the unconscious becomes highly imbalanced. Even though the conscious has a firmer control on the things that should be brought to surface, it doesn't always have the capacity to completely take control over the unconscious. The unconscious is perhaps more powerful than the conscious because we do not actually know what its confines are. So Freud compared the structure of the human psyche to an iceberg. Just like an iceberg being submerged nearly 3/4 into the ocean and exposing only a small part of it on the outside, the human psyche is also designed the same way. The unconscious part of the human psyche lies far deep into the ocean, and we are only able to see the brief part of the psyche, which would be the conscious. The pre-conscious is another realm where its contents are accessed or brought to awareness when we try a bit harder. But the unconscious is a realm that we cannot have any control over or we cannot have any access to. The conscious will try its best to avoid these elements from surfacing up from the unconscious. The conscious will try its best to adopt agreeable ways of gratifying the needs of the unconscious. But this may not always be possible. Sublimation is another important Freudian concept according to which the conscious will direct the needs or the urges that are generated from the unconscious towards something greater or towards something beneficial. For instance, development in career or social work, or more importantly, building something towards the betterment of society. This misdirection of the urges or the needs of the unconscious is called sublimation. Now, Freud believed that patients who suffered from hysteria or paranoia were those people who are unable to handle this part of the psyche, which would be the unconscious. So he came to the conclusion that when people are able to develop the strength to face or to come to terms with the elements of the unconscious, they will forever be cured. So he developed what would be the concept called transference. Transference is a technique in psychoanalysis where the psychoanalyst tries his best to make sure that the patient provides the contents of the unconscious through his own mouth. When the patient is able to identify the psychoanalyst as the person who had caused the traumatic experience from which he is actually suffering from, and if he is able to, in a healthy manner, talk to the psychoanalyst as if he was the father who affected him, or he was the thief that robbed him of his peace, he would automatically transfer the elements of the unconscious towards the psychoanalyst, and this is how the therapy actually takes place in curing the patient of his mental illness. Freud, in his later book Beyond the Pleasure Principle, defined the psyche as a three-part structure. He divided it into the id, the ego, and the superego. The id is predominantly, like the unconscious, is very unpredictable. It has no well-organized goals or motives. It works on the pleasure principle. It only seeks the gratification of pleasure. It doesn't mind the rules of the external world. It doesn't mind the healthiness of its own aims, but it only wants to seek pleasure in the quickest way possible. So, moving on to the ego is predominantly the conscious sphere, which functions in the reality principle. So the conscious or the ego will try its best to avoid the urges or the needs of the id being gratified, because it is not exactly always healthy to take the side of the id. So the id and the ego are often policed by what would be the superego. The superego is the set of all rules, morals, and ideologies that are developed by a person. You may even say that a person's superego is actually the superego that is given to him by his parents through moral teaching. The superego will punish the ego through regret or shame when it happens to yield to the needs of the id. And hence you can see how the ego is forever in a position to balance both the superego and the id. Now it comes to the question as to what literature has to do with all this. Freud believed that the unconscious was quite similar to literary works, because the unconscious is able to provide dreams. Dreams are provided by the unconscious in order to disguise certain elements that may surpass the censorship of the conscious. So dreams actually work in two different processes. Condensation takes place when two or more images or two or more events are condensed together into a single image or a single symbol and provided in a dream. And displacement takes place when a single image or a single person or an event is dispersed through a series of different images which are connected through association. Freud's concept of condensation and displacement was compared to Roman Jakobson's concept of metaphor and metonymy. Dreams are quite unique in the sense that they often incorporated the events of the day in order to disguise the contents of the unconscious further. So in this way, dreams are presenting to us the contents of the unconscious, and you may even say that through dreams we can even find a path towards the unconscious. When we are faced with a dream, we do not actually take it seriously, and hence this provides a way for us to get a glimpse of what exactly is happening inside the unconscious. Freud made the connection between literature and the unconscious based on the idea that fiction, drama, and poetry also made use of certain devices like metaphor, simile, imagery, and symbolism to make sure that the statements about life, the statements about the truths of life, often were represented in the most abstract manner possible. Like dreams, literature will also provide you with certain truths, but not in the direct way. What psychoanalytic critics do would be to understand how the overt meanings of the text is actually trying to give us a hint of what exactly is covered about the literary text. So in this way, you can say how the literary critic will try to use psychoanalysis in order to study the text as to what it really means in the deeper psychoanalytic level. So the critic will try his best to understand how a text has certain libidinal features. Psychoanalysis in this aspect is applied to the author, the reader, as well as the literary text. It can be best said that the literary text is a kind of a representation of the author's own unconscious. Through the literary text, we can even find the desires or motives or various feelings that the author is harboring inside his own unconscious. The literary characters that are created by the author are also considered as projections of the author. The psychoanalytic critics will go to the extent of treating literary characters as case studies. Detecting certain Freudian concepts like the Oedipus complex, sublimation, projection, or transference in a literary text is of primary importance to a literary critic who uses psychoanalysis. In short, a psychoanalytic critic will try to uncover the psyche of a literary text. Freud, in his interpretation of dreams, made a psychoanalysis of Hamlet, and he came to the conclusion that Hamlet's procrastination to kill his own uncle Claudius is due to the fact that Hamlet sees Claudius as a projection of his own folly, his own sin, his own need or desire for the mother, which is a kind of an Oedipus complex. Another important literary theorist to have used the Freudian approach would be Harold Bloom. He came up with what would be the anxiety of influence. According to this theory, the younger poet is afraid of being called as a product of the older generation of poets. He is afraid that his contribution to poetry will be regarded as a direct influence of the various poets that came before him. This is clearly alluding to Freud's concept of the Oedipus complex. Learning about psychoanalysis is a great introduction to what would be psychoanalytic criticism. So in this way we can understand how the influence of Freud has taken over various literary theorists in adopting his concepts or theories into literary works, and more importantly literary characters as well as authors. It will be useful for you to take a look at these literary critics who have made use of psychoanalysis. Prominent names include Norman Holland, Jacques Lacan, Peter Brooks, and Julia Kristeva.